Hello everyone, welcome to the Sleep History channel. Today we listen. The Roman Empire is often remembered as one of the greatest civilizations in human history. An empire of vast roads, monumental architecture, powerful armies, and sophisticated governance. Images of marble temples, grand amphitheaters like the Colosseum, and wealthy senators dominate popular imagination. But beneath this grandeur lived the overwhelming majority of the population. The poor. These were the laborers, slaves, freedmen, and unemployed masses who formed the backbone of Roman society. Their lives were not filled with glory, but with struggle, uncertainty, and survival. While emperors like Augustus and Nero shaped history, it was the poor who kept the empire running, often at great personal cost. Who were the poor in Rome? In Roman society, poverty was not a single condition, it was a wide spectrum. The urban poor, plebeians. The majority of Rome's population consisted of plebeians, common citizens. While some were moderately well off, many lived at or below subsistence level. These urban poor lived in crowded cities like Rome, surviving on daily wages. They worked as construction laborers, porters and dock workers, street vendors. Craftsmen. However, their income was unstable. Missing even a few days of work could mean starvation. Point 2. Slaves. The lowest class. At the very bottom were slaves, millions of them across the empire. Slavery was a central pillar of Roman economics. Slaves worked in households, farms, latifundia, mines, the harshest conditions, public works. Unlike free poor citizens, slaves had no legal rights. Their lives depended entirely on their masters. Some were treated relatively well, especially educated slaves, but many endured brutal conditions. Freedmen. Between two worlds, freed slaves, known as freedmen, occupied an in-between status. They were technically free but often remained economically dependent on their former masters. They could work as merchants or craftsmen, earn money, gain limited social mobility, yet they still faced social stigma and were rarely accepted as equals by the elite. Housing. Living in the Insulae 2.1. The Roman slums. Most poor Romans lived in apartment buildings called insulae. These structures were the ancient equivalent of crowded slums. Unlike the luxurious villas of the rich, insulae were overcrowded, poorly constructed, dangerous. A single building could house dozens of families in tiny rooms. Living conditions. Life inside an insula was extremely difficult. No running water on upper floors, no sanitation systems, shared or public toilets, fire hazards due to wooden construction. The higher you lived, the worse conditions became. The poorest people lived on the top floors where rent was cheaper but life was more dangerous. Fires and collapses. Urban disasters were common. Buildings frequently collapsed due to poor construction, caught fire and spread rapidly. One of the most famous disasters was the Great Fire of Rome, which destroyed large parts of the city and left thousands homeless. Food and survival. Basic diet of the poor. The diet of poor Romans was simple and often inadequate. Their main foods included bread, their staple, porridge, called pulse, vegetables, onions, cabbage. Meat was rare and usually only eaten during festivals. Grain dole, state support. To prevent unrest, the Roman government provided free or subsidized grain to citizens. This system, known as the annona, was critical for survival. Without it, many would have starved. However, it also created dependency. The poor relied heavily on state handouts, especially in cities like Rome. 3. Malnutrition and hunger. Even with grain distributions, many people suffered from malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, chronic hunger. Life expectancy among the poor was significantly lower than among the wealthy. Work, hard labor, low pay for. Daily struggle for income. Most poor Romans lived day to day. There were no job contracts or long-term security. Work was physically demanding, poorly paid, inconsistent. A laborer might find work one day and none the next. 2. Dangerous jobs. Some of the worst jobs included mining, extremely deadly, construction dock labor in mines, especially workers, often slaves, faced near certain early death due to harsh conditions. Women and children also worked. Women, domestic service, textile work. Children, apprenticeships or child labor was common and necessary for family survival. Health and disease. Lack of health care. There was no public health care system for the poor. Doctors existed, but they were expensive, mostly served the wealthy. The poor relied on home remedies, religious rituals. Disease in crowded cities. Urban life made disease spread rapidly. Common illnesses included tuberculosis, dysentery, malaria, poor sanitation, and overcrowding made outbreaks frequent. Life expectancy. Life expectancy was shockingly low. Many children died young. Adults often lived only into their 30s or 40s. For the poor, survival itself was an achievement. Entertainment, escape from reality. Despite their hardships, poor Romans still sought entertainment. Bread and circuses. Roman leaders used a policy known as panem et circenses, bread and circuses, to keep the population content. They provided free food, public games, says. Gladiator games, events at the Colosseum were extremely popular. Poor citizens could watch. Gladiator battles, animal hunts, public executions. These spectacles were both entertainment and political tools. Conclusion of Part 1. Life for poor people in the Roman Empire was harsh, unstable, and often short. While the empire is remembered for its achievements, it was built on the labor and suffering of millions who lived in poverty. They faced overcrowded housing, uncertain work, limited food, constant health risks, yet they endured. Their resilience kept the empire functioning, even as they remained largely invisible in its grand narratives. Part 2. Survival, Crime, and Inequality. Crime and survival in the streets. For many of Rome's poor, survival often meant walking a thin line between legality and crime. In overcrowded cities like Rome, poverty pushed people into desperate choices. Petty crime as a way of life. When food was scarce and work was unavailable, theft became common. Typical crimes included stealing bread or grain, pickpocketing. In crowded markets, robbing travelers at night. These were not always acts of greed, but of survival. Organized crime and gangs. Rome had its own version of street gangs. These groups controlled neighborhoods, intimidated citizens, influenced politics. During the late Republic, figures like Publius Clodius Pulcher used gangs to gain political power, showing how deeply crime and politics were connected. Harsh punishments. The Roman legal system was extremely unequal. For the poor, minor crimes could lead to execution. Punishments were brutal and public. For the rich, fines or exile were more. Common justice was not blind, it favored wealth and status. Social inequality. A divided society. The gap between rich and poor Roman society had one of the widest wealth gaps in history. The elite lived in luxury. Marble houses, private baths, lavish feasts. Meanwhile, the poor lived in cramped insulae, struggled for daily meals, had no security. This contrast was visible everywhere in cities like Rome. Patron-client system. One survival strategy for the poor was becoming a client of a wealthy patron. This system involved the poor offering loyalty and services, the rich providing money, food, or protection every morning. Clients would visit their patron's house to show respect, a ritual known as the salutatio. But this relationship was unequal and often humiliating. Political manipulation of the poor. The poor were often used as political tools. Leaders would distribute free grain, organize games, promise reforms to gain support. This manipulation played a role in major events like the fall of the Roman Republic, where social tensions exploded into civil wars. Rural poverty. Life outside the city. Not all poor Romans lived in cities. Many struggled in the countryside. Life on latifundia, large agricultural estates known as latifundia, dominated rural life. These estates were owned by wealthy elites, worked by slaves and poor laborers. Free peasants often lost their land and were forced to work for others. Debt and land law, small farmers faced constant risks. Crop failure, debt accumulation, loss of land. Many were pushed into poverty and migrated to cities, increasing urban overcrowding. Isolation and hardship, rural poor had fewer opportunities, limited access to markets, no public grain distribution, little protection from exploitation. Their lives were just as hard, if not harder, than urban poor. Slavery, the harshest reality. Brutal conditions. Slaves experienced the worst conditions in Roman society, particularly in mines, farms, construction sites. They worked long hours with little food, physical punishment. No freedom in mines, life expectancy was extremely low. Q2, resistance and rebellion. Despite harsh conditions, slaves resisted. The most famous revolt was led by Spartacus, who led a massive uprising against Rome. This event, known as the Spartacus Slave Revolt, terrified the Roman elite and showed the dangers of widespread oppression. Psychological impact. Slavery didn't just destroy bodies, it broke identities. Slaves had no control over their lives, could be sold or punished at any time, lived in constant fear. Even after gaining freedom, many carried lifelong trauma. Family life among the poor. 11. Fragile households. Family life for the poor was unstable. Challenges included financial stress, disease. High child mortality. Families often struggled just to stay together. Role of women. Women in poor households worked constantly, managing the home, earning income, raising children. They had fewer rights but carried heavy responsibilities. Children growing up in poverty. Children faced a harsh reality. Early labor, limited education, high risk of death. For many, childhood was short and difficult. Q. Religion and hope. 12.1. Turning to the gods. Religion was a major source of comfort. The poor prayed to Roman gods for food, health, protection. Temples and rituals offered psychological relief. Rise of new beliefs. New religions began attracting the poor, especially those offering hope and equality. One such movement was early Christianity, which spread among lower classes despite persecution under emperors like Nero. Conclusion of Part 2. The lives of poor Romans were shaped by struggle, inequality, and survival. They lived in a world where justice was unequal. Wealth determined power. Survival often required desperation. Yet even in such harsh conditions, they built communities, raised families, found hope in religion and resilience. To truly understand poverty in the Roman Empire, we need to step into a single day. Let's imagine a poor laborer living in Rome around 100 AD. 3.1. Early morning, the struggle begins before sunrise. He wakes up in a cramped room inside an insula. There is no proper bed, no heating in winter, noise from neighbors all night. He shares this tiny space with family members. Privacy does not exist. Breakfast? Often nothing. If lucky, a piece of stale bread, leftover porridge. Then he heads out, because if he doesn't work today, he doesn't eat today. To morning. Searching for work. There is no guaranteed job. He joins a crowd of laborers in the streets, waiting for employers, hoping to be selected. Some get hired for construction, carrying goods, cleaning. Others go home empty-handed. This uncertainty defines his life. Afternoon, exhaustion and hunger. If he finds work, the conditions are harsh. Long hours, heavy physical labor. Little rest. Payment is minimal, just enough for basic food. Lunch is often bread, cheap wine, maybe vegetables, meat. Almost never. For evening. Returning to survival. After work, he returns home through crowded, dirty streets. The city smells of waste smoke, rotting garbage. Back in the insula. No clean water upstairs, no proper sanitation, Dinner is simple. Whatever. He could afford that day. The night. Fear and uncertainty. Night brings danger. Rome at night is dark, lawless, unsafe. Crime increases after sunset. Fires can break out at any moment. He sleeps knowing tomorrow may be worse. Work is not guaranteed. Survival is uncertain. Fine. A story. The life of Marcus. Let's turn history into something human. Marcus is a fictional character, but his life is based on real conditions. One childhood, Marcus was born into poverty in Rome. His father was a laborer. His mother worked in a household. From a young age, he saw hunger, he saw struggle, he saw people die young. At age 10, he started working. No school, no childhood. 2. Youth. As a teenager, Marcus worked in construction. He carried stones mixed materials, worked under harsh supervisors. Injuries were common. There was no compensation. If he couldn't work, he didn't get paid. Adulthood. Marcus marries a poor woman. They live in a small room in an insula. They have children, but not all survive. Disease takes one. Hunger weakens another. Still, life continues. For old age, if he reaches it, most poor Romans never reached old age. If Marcus is lucky, his body is broken from labor. He cannot work anymore without savings or support. Survival becomes even harder. Depends on his children. Occasional charity. 15. Women in poverty. Double struggle. 15.1. Daily burden. Poor women faced even greater hardship. They had to manage the household work to earn money, care for children, all at the same time. Exploitation and abuse. Many women faced exploitation by employers, harassment. Lack of legal protection. Some were forced into prostitution just to survive. 3. Strength and survival. Despite everything, women were the backbone of poor families. They kept households running, raised children, supported their partners. Their resilience was extraordinary. The psychological reality of poverty. Poverty in Rome was not just physical, it was mental. Constant stress. The poor lived with fear of hunger, fear of illness, fear of losing everything. This created constant anxiety. Loss of dignity. Many had to beg for help, depend on patrons, accept humiliation. Dignity was often sacrificed for survival. 3. Hope versus reality. Some hoped for better work, social mobility, a better future for their children, but for most, these hopes remained out of reach. Why they stayed silent? You might think, why didn't they revolt? The answer is complex. Porn. Fear of punishment. Rome punished rebellion harshly. Executions were public, brutal, meant as warnings. 17. Survival. First, most people were too busy surviving to rebel. Daily life required all their energy. 3. Control. Through entertainment, events at the Colosseum distracted the population. Games and spectacles kept people entertained, distracted, less likely to revolt. Conclusion of Part 3. The life of a poor Roman was not just difficult, it was relentless. Every day was a fight, for food, for work, for survival. Yet, within this struggle, there was humanity, families, love, hope. The Roman Empire may be remembered for its greatness, but its true foundation was built on the lives of people like Marcus, ordinary individuals who endured extraordinary hardship. When people talk about the Roman Empire, they often focus on military power, engineering achievements, political systems, but this creates an illusion. Because the reality is, the empire's greatness was built on inequality. The roads, aqueducts, and monuments were not created by emperors alone. They were built by poor laborers, slaves, forgotten workers. Their names were never recorded, but their labor shaped history. Wealth concentration and power. 19.1. A system designed for the elite Roman society was structured to benefit the wealthy. The elite controlled land, controlled politics, controlled resources. Meanwhile, the poor had Little influence, no security. Limited opportunities. 9.2. Land. Power land ownership was the main source of wealth. Large estates, latifundia, expanded while small farmers lost land. Rural poverty increased. This imbalance contributed to major crises, including the crisis of the 3rd century, when economic and political instability shook the empire. Urban dependency and control. Bread as a tool of power. The Roman government provided grain to keep the population calm. This wasn't just generosity, it was strategy. Free food meant less rebellion, more control, political stability. Bread and circuses. The policy of keeping people fed and entertained prevented unrest. Mass events at places like the Colosseum created distraction. People focused on games, spectacles, survival, instead of questioning the system. Did the poor have any chance to rise? 21.1 Limited social mobility. In theory, some movement was possible. A poor person could become a successful merchant, gain wealth, improve status, but in reality, this was rare. 2 Freedmen success stories. Some freed slaves became wealthy. However, they still faced social discrimination. They were not fully accepted by elites. Their success did not change the system. It was the exception, not the rule. Comparing ancient poverty to modern times. 2. Similarities. Surprisingly, many aspects of Roman poverty still exist today. Income inequality, slum-like housing, job insecurity, dependence on state support. The structure may have changed, but the struggle feels familiar. 2. Key differences. However, there are important differences. Today, many countries offer healthcare systems, education, legal rights in Rome. None of these protections existed for the poor. Survival depended almost entirely on luck and physical ability. The fall of Rome and the role of inequality. The fall of Rome was not caused by one factor, but inequality played a role. Over time, wealth concentrated in fewer hands, the poor became more desperate, social stability weakened. Events like the fall of the Western Roman Empire marked the end of an era, but the internal weaknesses had been building for centuries. The forgotten majority. History often remembers emperors, generals, battles, but it forgets the majority. The poor built the cities, worked the land, sustained the economy, yet they remained invisible in historical records. Final reflection. The human cost of empire. The Roman Empire was powerful, but it was not equal. For the poor, life meant constant struggle, limited opportunity, uncertain survival, and yet they endured. They raised families, built communities, found meaning in hardship. Final conclusion. The story of poor people in the Roman Empire is not just about suffering, it's about reality. It reminds us that every great empire has 2 sides, one of glory, one of struggle. Rome's greatness was real, but so was its inequality. And if we truly want to understand history, we must look beyond the monuments and into the lives of the people who lived in their shadows.